Welcome to the Hindu Daily.
It's good to be back.
Today is Monday, January 26th, 2026. And we've got a really packed set of articles in front of us, 11 of them. Looking through the list, it covers everything from, AI ethics all the way to geopolitical currency wars.
It really feels like we're looking at a world in flux. The theme that seems to connect all of these pieces is, well, it's about old rules being challenged and new ones being written, sometimes on the fly.
That's a great way to put it. So our mission today is to break all this down piece by piece and really get to the heart of why it matters to you, the listener. Let's jump right in with the news section.
Sounds good.
And we're starting with a birthday of sorts. Wikipedia just turned 25 years old this month.
A quarter century. That's amazing to think about. A whole generation has grown up with it.
It really is. And you'd think with the rise of ChatGPT, Gemini, all these incredibly powerful AI tools, that something like Wikipedia might feel a bit dated.
A bit of a dinosaur, yeah. Why read an encyclopedia when you can just ask a bot to write the summary for you?
Exactly. But the founder, Jimmy Wales, gave a talk recently, and he's making a really bold claim. He says the world is actually better off because these AI models are reading Wikipedia.
Which at first sounds a little self-serving, doesn't it? Like he's trying to keep it relevant.
It does, but he has a point. He asks you to imagine the alternative. What if an AI model was trained exclusively on, say, the data from X, formerly Twitter?
Oh, wow. That would be chaotic.
A complete nightmare, right? The AI would be polarized, sarcastic, full of misinformation. Wales's argument is that Wikipedia provides this grounded, fact-checked baseline, a sort of truth set that stops these models from going completely off the deep end.
So it's the guardrail for AI's education. That makes sense. But he talked about something else that I found even more interesting, something called the Edelman Trust Barometer.
Right, the trust deficit. We hear about declining trust in the media and in politics all the time. What was his new take on it?
It was this idea he calls misplaced trust. He says we think that being cynical, believing all politicians are liars, makes us smarter or more skeptical.
It's a defense mechanism, I suppose.
Exactly. But he argues it's actually incredibly dangerous. Because if you believe everyone is fundamentally dishonest, you stop looking for integrity. It no longer becomes a factor in your choice.
You just pick the one you dislike the least?
Yeah.
Or the one who is most entertaining?
Precisely. You give yourself permission to make a bad choice because you've already decided the whole system is rigged anyway. It's cynicism leading to apathy.
That's a pretty bleak thought. And that connects directly to what he was saying about AI, doesn't it? The whole hallucination problem?
It does. He made this great point that 30 years ago, our vision of AI was, well, it was basically Spock from Star Trek.
Cold, logical, matter of fact.
Yes. We thought we were building the ultimate fact checker. And instead, he says, we got an AI that is creative, crazy, and makes things up. It lies with a straight face.
And if you're already cynical about human sources, you might just blindly trust the machine because it sounds confident.
That's the danger. And he contrasts this with the Wikipedia community. He has this wonderful term for them. He calls them sweet nerds.
Sweet nerds. I love that.
It's perfect. He says it is just incredibly difficult to fool a community of hobbyists who are willing to spend their weekend debating the citation for a fact about, say, 18th century botany.
They live for the details. You can't just create a fake website and expect it to get past them.
Not a chance. He sees them as a kind of digital immune system, protecting the truth against the confident falsehoods that AI can generate. They're the firewall.
It's a really compelling argument for the value of human curation. Okay, let's pivot now from that digital world to something very real and grounded. Rural India. We're moving to the editorial section.
Right, and we're looking at a new piece of legislation, the VBG-Ramji Act.
That's a mouthful. It stands for the Viksit Bharat Guarantee for Rozgar and Ajivika Mission Gramin Act.
And this is the act that's set to replace the MGNREGA, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme that's been around for years.
A very well-known scheme.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the government's pitch, coming from Union Minister Shivraj Singh Chauhan, is that this is a straightforward upgrade. They're increasing the guarantee from 100 days of work to 125.
And on the surface, that sounds like a clear win for rural workers, doesn't it? More work, more security.
It does. But the editorial we're looking at says you have to read the fine print, specifically a clause in Section 5, subsection 1.
This is where the whole idea of a guarantee starts to fall apart, according to the article.
Okay, so break that down for us. What's the change in Section 5.1?
Well, under the old MGNREGA, the right to work was basically universal for any rural adult willing to do unskilled manual labor. The state was obligated to provide it.
It was a legal entitlement.
Yes. The new act changes that. It says the guarantee only applies in rural areas that are notified by the central government.
Notified. That one word sounds like it carries a lot of weight. So the government can choose not to notify a certain area.
That's exactly what it implies. It creates what the article calls a switch-off loophole. The central government could, in theory, decide that a particular district doesn't get the notification.
And what would be the reasoning for that?
It could be anything. They might deem it developed enough, or, more cynically, it could be a district that voted for an opposition party. It changes a universal right into a benefit that's given out at the government's discretion.
That is a fundamental shift in the power dynamic. And the editorial also talks about a shift in funding, from demand-driven to something called normative allocation.
Right. This sounds like technical budget jargon, but the implications are huge.
Explain the difference for us.
The old system was demand-driven. So if a state like Bihar was hit by a severe drought, the demand for work would naturally spike. Under the law, the funding had to follow that distress. The budget was elastic.
It responded to real-world conditions.
Precisely. Normative allocation is the opposite. It means the government decides in advance from Delhi what the norm for that state's budget should be. It's a fixed cap.
So what happens if a disaster strikes and the need for work shoots way past that pre-decided cap?
The money runs out, the tap goes dry. And the editorial argues this will hurt the poorest states the most, places like Bihar and Jharkhand. Their needs, especially in a crisis, will almost certainly exceed any norm set by a distant bureaucrat.
You're essentially penalizing states for being in distress. And there's a tech angle to this as well, isn't there? The new act promotes advanced digital systems to fight corruption.
It does, but we've seen how this can backfire. The article calls it disentitlement through technology. It brings up that big issue from 2017 where wages were being diverted into the wrong digital wallets.
I remember that. People's wages were ending up in Airtel payment wallets they didn't even know they had.
Exactly, because of glitches in linking Aadhaar and bank accounts. The point is, when the tech becomes too complex and opaque, it doesn't eliminate corruption. It just creates a new kind of middleman, someone you have to pay a bribe to just to figure out how to navigate the system and get your own money.
So a system meant to empower can end up doing the exact opposite. It's a cautionary tale.
A big one. The editorial concludes that the act is basically a repackaging exercise designed to let the government claim credit for an upgrade while actually weakening the core rights of workers.
Speaking of things not translating properly, let's move to our second editorial. This one is about climate action, but from a really interesting perspective, the language we use to talk about it.
Yes, this piece explores what it calls the semantic gap. It's about how these big global terms we use at UN conferences and in scientific papers can lose their meaning entirely by the time they reach a village in India.
Give us an example of that. What's a term that gets lost in translation?
The best example in the article is loss and damage. Now, in international climate negotiations, that's a profound, almost existential concept.
It's not just about money, right? It's about losing things you can't replace.
Exactly. It's the irreversible loss of your culture, your ancestral land, your community's identity because of climate change. It's a deep, grieving sort of term.
Okay, so what happens to that term when it gets translated for local administration in India?
It becomes something like nuksan aklan, which means damage assessment, or apda rahat, which means disaster relief.
Wow. So it goes from this huge, irreversible, existential loss
to basically just compensation for broken things.
Yeah.
It collapses the meaning down to a simple transaction. Here's a check for the roof that blew off your house. The entire sense of cultural loss is just gone.
It completely sanitizes the crisis. And the article says this problem isn't just with words, but with data, too.
Yes, it calls it the data paradox. India has some incredibly advanced science. We have sophisticated heat wave projections, complex flood models. But that data often isn't usable for the person on the ground who needs to make a decision, like a district magistrate or a village leader.
So what's the solution? How do you bridge that gap?
The article argues we need to start treating communication as a form of infrastructure, just as important as the sensors and satellites. It points to Odisha's success in handling cyclones.
Right, they have a fantastic track record.
And that success wasn't just about having better technology or better warnings. It was built on years of establishing trust. People believed the alerts they were getting and acted on them.
So the key isn't just giving people data, but giving them actionable advice they trust.
Precisely. Don't just tell a village council the heat index is projected to rise by 3 degrees. Tell them school timings need to change next week. Or outdoor labor must stop between noon and 4 p.m. Connect the science directly to a decision. Trust is the critical infrastructure.
That's a powerful insight. Okay, let's move on to our opinion section. We're zooming out to the global level, and it seems the very fabric of the internet is being pulled in different directions.
Yeah, this piece is about what it calls the fractured sovereignty of global cyber governance. It's all centered on a new Convention Against Cybercrime that was adopted by the UN General Assembly back in December 2024.
A UN convention sounds like it should be a moment for global unity.
You'd think so, but this one was the opposite. It was deeply divisive. The main proponents were Russia and China, who were really pushing to reshape the internet's rules to give more control to the state.
And who was on the other side?
The traditional Western bloc, the US, Japan, Canada, much of Europe, they opposed it. They're still aligned with the older Budapest Convention, which is more focused on an open multi-stakeholder model.
So you have these two competing visions for the internet, but the article says the interesting player here was India. What did India do?
India abstained. It chose not to sign on.
Oh, sit on the fence.
The core issue was sovereignty over data. India felt that its own proposals for giving nations more institutional control over their data were being ignored in the process. New Delhi felt sidelined.
So India is trying to carve out a third path, essentially. Neither the fully open Western model nor the state-controlled Sino-Russian one.
That seems to be the strategy, but the article warns that this is leading to a world of polycentricism, not one internet, but many fragmented ones. And it points out a growing divergence between the principles India states globally and the actual practices it's developing at home.
What's an example of that?
The draft rules for AI watermarking. Globally, the principles for AI safety are quite vague, but India's proposed rules are incredibly prescriptive, demanding that labels cover 10% of the generated content.
So we risk creating a splinter net, where an AI model built in the U.S. might be illegal to run in India without significant recoding.
Exactly. Every country having its own specific technical rulebook, it's a huge challenge for global tech.
Speaking of global systems under strain, let's look at the next opinion piece, which is about the energy crisis in Cuba. This feels like a very stark example of what happens when a critical supply chain breaks.
It's a devastating story. The article reports that Cuba is facing massive, rolling blackouts and severe food shortages. And the reason is that 80% of their food is imported and relies on refrigeration, which is now failing.
And this all traces back to the collapse of one specific deal, right? The oil for doctors scheme.
Yes, that was the lifeline. For years, Venezuela provided Cuba with heavily subsidized oil. In return, Cuba sent thousands of doctors, teachers, and military advisors to Venezuela. It was a barter system, essentially.
What broke that system?
The U.S. military incursion into Venezuela, which led to the abduction of President Maduro. After that, the U.S. began seizing oil tankers heading from Venezuela to Cuba. The flow of oil just stopped.
And the numbers are staggering. In 2022, Venezuela was supplying 3/4 of Cuba's oil. By 2025, that had dropped to barely a third of what they need daily.
And other countries like Mexico and Russia haven't been able to fill that gap.
So why can't Cuba just go out and buy oil on the open market like any other country?
That's the cruel twist. They can't. Because the United States has designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, they are effectively locked out of the global financial system.
It makes them radioactive to banks.
Exactly. No major bank will process a transaction for them for fear of massive U.S. sanctions. So even if they could find the money, they have no way to pay for the oil. The U.S. embargo plus that designation creates a financial blockade that's as effective as a naval one.
They are completely trapped. No oil, no credit, and the lights are literally going out. It's a powerful illustration of how financial policy can be weaponized.
It absolutely is.
A grim reality. Okay, let's shift gears and head to the science section. We're returning to the topic of AI, but this time looking at its role in scientific publishing and peer review.
This article is called The Machine in the Library, and it starts with a really mind-boggling statistic. In the year 2020 alone, human peer reviewers spent a cumulative total of around 15,000 years reading and reviewing academic papers.
15,000 years. In 1 year. That's an incredible amount of human effort.
It's immense, and these are highly skilled scientists and academics doing this work, usually for free. They're completely burned out, so you can see why publishers are desperate to bring in AI to help.
So what's the plan? How is AI being used?
Right now, it's mostly for screening. AI tools are being used to check manuscripts for plagiarism, to make sure they follow formatting rules, to check for statistical errors, and even to help match a paper with the best possible human reviewers.
Basically cutting down on the tedious administrative work, as one publisher has quoted. AI cuts their time doing the same thing. It seems like a no-brainer. Where's the downside?
The big risk the article highlights is a phenomenon called amplification
Amplification of what?
of errors. Imagine an AI summarizes a scientific paper, but in the process it misunderstands a nuance or makes a small mistake, a hallucination. Then future scientists, instead of reading the original paper, just read the convenient AI summary and cite that.
And the mistake gets repeated and spreads.
Exactly. It gets amplified through the literature until a small error becomes an accepted fact. The AI models can also create a kind of echo chamber because they're trained on past data. They tend to overrepresent highly cited, older work and might miss newer, more radical research that corrects those older ideas.
And there was another concept in there, generative friction. What did the author mean by that?
That was a point made by Dr. Redquist. He argues that the struggle of reading a difficult paper is actually a good thing. That cognitive effort, that friction, is what sparks new ideas. It forces you to really engage with the material and see connections the original author might have missed.
So if AI makes everything too easy, too smooth,
You lose that creative spark. It's like the difference between navigating with a map versus just following a GPS. With the map, you learn the terrain. With the GPS, you just get to the destination without really understanding how you got there.
so the consensus is that AI should be a tool to augment human reviewers, not replace them.
Yes. Let it handle the plagiarism checks and formatting, but leave the core judgment about a paper's novelty and significance to the sweet nerds.
A great connection back to our first story.
Okay.
Let's move to the text and context section. We have 3 articles here, starting with solar energy and what the article calls solar sovereignty.
Right. This is centered on a specific event. On January 7th, 2026, the United States officially withdrew from 66 international bodies, and one of them was the International Solar Alliance, or ISA.
Now, the ISA is a big deal for India. It's an Indian-led initiative, so the U.S. pulling out sounds like it would be a major blow.
You would think so, but the article argues that for India itself, the impact is surprisingly minimal.
Really? How so?
Well, financially, the U.S. was a very small contributor to the ISA's budget, only about 1% of the total funds, so it's not a financial hit. And more importantly, India has become incredibly self-reliant in solar manufacturing.
The numbers on that were pretty impressive.
They're huge. A manufacturing capacity of 144 gigawatts for solar modules and 25 gigawatts for cells. The jobs are domestic, the manufacturing is domestic, so a U.S. withdrawal has zero impact on Indian tariffs or projects. India has achieved, as the title says, solar sovereignty.
So if India isn't hurt by this, who is? Who loses when the U.S. leaves the table?
The real risk is for the rest of the global south, for countries in Africa or Southeast Asia.
Why them specifically?
Because their solar projects often depend on international finance and, well, on confidence. When the U.S. is part of an alliance, it signals stability to international lenders and investors. When the U.S. walks away, those lenders might get spooked. The risk premium for a project in, say, Nigeria or Vietnam goes up.
So India's projects are safe, but the ISA's global mission to help other developing nations gets harder.
That's the real impact. Interestingly, the article also notes a potential strategic upside for India. With the U.S. turning inward and its ongoing tensions with China, Indian solar manufacturers might actually find new opportunities to export to the American market.
A fascinating silver lining. Okay, from the sun to the ice. The next piece is about China and Antarctica.
A huge geopolitical shift happening at the bottom of the world. In December of 2025, China proposed a new draft law, the Antarctic Activities and Environmental Protection Law.
Now wait, isn't Antarctica governed by an international treaty system? Why is China passing its own domestic law?
That is precisely the point. This is a classic move in what's sometimes called lawfare. The Antarctic Treaty is in place, yes, but by creating its own detailed domestic law, China is signaling a shift. It's moving from just being a participant in the existing system to becoming a rule shaper.
How did that work in practice?
Well, the law, for example, would apply to any foreign entity, a research team, a tourist vessel that departs for Antarctica from a Chinese port. So they're using their domestic law to project their standards and regulations onto the continent itself.
And they have the physical presence to back it up, don't they?
They certainly do. 5 research stations, advanced icebreakers like the Shillong 2. The law has some standard provisions. It bans mineral exploitation and military combat operations. but it allows peaceful use, which is a famously ambiguous term.
So China gets to define what peaceful use means in the areas where it operates.
Exactly. It's a way of using national law to enforce and interpret an international treaty on its own terms. It's a power move, and it's one that other major players are watching very closely.
It seems like every domain is becoming a contested one. Now, for the final piece in this section, a very powerful one, titled Racial Injustice and the Global Awakening of White America.
Yes, this is a deep sociological analysis that draws a direct line between the events of 2020 and what's happening now in 2026.
So what's the current context it's looking at?
It's focusing on the large-scale protests happening right now, particularly in Minneapolis, against the Trump administration's ICE deportation raids, and specifically in response to the shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy.
And it connects this back to the George Floyd protests 6 years ago. What's the core of the argument?
The author uses a really effective scientific metaphor. They talk about the null hypothesis.
The null hypothesis being the default assumption, the thing you believe until it's proven wrong.
Exactly. And for centuries, the null hypothesis for much of white America was that the system is generally fair and that incidents of police brutality are isolated, tragic exceptions.
The bad apples argument.
Yes. The article argues that what Darnella Fraser's video of George Floyd's murder did was provide a sample size of evidence so visceral, so undeniable, that it forced millions of people to reject that null hypothesis.
It shattered the default assumption.
It did. It provided the proof that the system wasn't fair, that this was a systemic problem. It forced an awakening. And the article quotes Dr. Martin Luther King from 1967 saying white America needed to understand it was poisoned to its soul by racism and that this needed to be carefully documented. The video was that documentation.
And the argument is that we're seeing a similar dynamic play out now in 2026.
Yes, that the images and stories coming out of the ICE raids are providing a new, powerful sample size. They are once again shattering the illusion of fairness for a broad, multiracial coalition of people, which is why the protests are so large and diverse, not just in the U.S., but globally.
It's a profound reminder that seeing is believing, and that documented evidence is what truly drives social change. A powerful piece. Okay, let's head to our final section for today, business.
And we're starting with some high-stakes drama in the currency markets. It's all about the Japanese yen versus the U.S. dollar.
The situation is that the yen has been stubbornly weak, right? It's been falling and falling.
Terribly weak. And things came to a head when the New York Federal Reserve conducted what's called a rate check.
Now, to a normal person, a rate check sounds completely harmless, like just calling up to ask for a price. Why did that send shockwaves through the market?
Because in the world of foreign exchange, the central bank isn't just another customer. They are the biggest player in the room. When the Fed starts calling major banks to ask for quotes on the yen, it's not because they're curious.
It's a signal.
It's a warning shot. They're basically saying, we are watching this price very closely and we are preparing to act. The market interprets it as a sign that a massive coordinated intervention to prop up the yen could be imminent.
So it's a way of trying to move the market without actually spending any money yet.
Exactly. And it worked for a bit. The yen strengthened. But the bigger question is what happens next. Because for Japan to truly save the yen, they have to buy massive amounts of it. And to get the money to do that, they have to sell their reserves of U.S. dollars.
And where does Japan keep most of its dollar reserves?
In U.S. Treasury bonds, the safest asset in the world.
So if Japan starts dumping billions of dollars worth of U.S. treasuries onto the market to buy its own currency,
the price of those U.S. bonds will fall, which means their yield, the interest rate will spike. And that has huge knock-on effects.
So Japan, trying to fix its own currency problem, could end up making mortgages and car loans more expensive for Americans in Ohio or Florida.
That is the direct connection, and the Trump administration would hate that. They want a weak dollar to help American exports, but they absolutely cannot afford a chaotic spike in U.S. interest rates. So everyone is walking on a tightrope.
A very delicate and dangerous balance. Okay, finally we have a story that reads like a blockbuster movie. A sitting president suing the country's largest bank.
Yes, President Trump is personally suing JPMorgan Chase and its CEO, Jamie Dimon, for $5 billion.
And this all goes back to early 2021, right after the January 6th Capitol riots.
It does. In April of 2021, JPMorgan Chase made the decision to close all of the bank accounts associated with Trump's businesses.
And Trump's allegation is that this was a purely political move.
He's claiming they created a malicious blacklist and shared it with other banks to damage his business, which is a legal claim known as trade libel. He says they debanked him for his political views.
What's the bank's defense? Can a bank just decide to fire a client, even if that client is a former or current president?
Well, this is a fascinating legal gray area. The bank denies any blacklist, and they point to the standard agreements that all customers sign, which typically allow a bank to close an account for a variety of reasons, including legal or regulatory risk, without having to give a specific cause.
They often cite reputational risk as well, don't they?
That's the key phrase. Banks have very broad discretion to cut ties with clients they feel are too controversial or toxic for their brand. Proving that a decision was purely political and not based on a legitimate risk assessment is very difficult.
So it's Trump's word against the bank's internal risk policies.
Essentially, yes. He's using a Florida law on unfair trade practices to make his case, but it's an uphill battle. Still, the spectacle of it is just extraordinary.
A sitting president suing the nation's biggest bank. It's a fitting end to our deep dive today, isn't it? A world where it feels like every established norm, from international treaties to basic banking relationships, is being challenged and fought over.
It really is a time of, as we said earlier, immense friction.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's deep dive. We hope this journey through the headlines has helped you connect the dots and make a bit more sense of the noise out there.
It was a pleasure unpacking it all with you.
Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.